But being at my age at the time, 19, it didn't really occur to me as being very serious. I thought it would be over probably in about 6 months. I think most of us did. How wrong we were. I volunteered with the military police because just previously I'd applied for the Birmingham City Police Force. I was hell-bent on being a policeman at the time. And I passed my written and physical examinations, was accepted, and then subsequently I was informed by them that they suspended recruiting because of the war. And I saw an advertisement in the Yorkshire Post inviting applicants for the Army's military police. So I thought, well, that's a good alternative. So I went to Leeds for interview and was accepted, and that was the reason I volunteered and joined up at the time. In the military police, largely, we were responsible for making sure that soldiers behaved in various towns, and also for escort duties of convoys and point duties and things like that. Generally what one would expect of a civil policeman.
So is it a popular profession?
Yes, it was. I thought it was very good training for the police force, and would befit me to rejoin the civil police force at the end of the war. I had an accident. In fact, we were escorting a convoy from the northeast down to Gloucestershire, and I was on a motorcycle. All military policemen had motorcycles at the time, and I ran into a Bren gun carrier, or more correctly, a Bren gun carrier ran into me. It came out of a concealed side road and gave me very little option but to hit it. And I braked as hard as I could and had the presence of mind to hold my head back, because I thought if my head hits the steel outer casing of the Bren gun carrier, that's it. But it put me into hospital, 2 different hospitals for 6 months. Damaged my right leg, with which I've had trouble ever since, on and off. Not seriously, but I knew it's there. And that was the reason for my downgrading to B7 from A1, super fit, to B7. But it didn't prevent my being sent abroad. The VP wing, or they were known as the Blue Caps, as against the Red Caps, were responsible for guarding very important government depots and property. Ammunition dumps, for example, military establishment. For example, the one at Bletchley, you know, where the codes were broken. Things like that. I was on an exercise with the Blue Caps, with the VP wing of the police, in South Wales. And I met up with an officer from the Intelligence Corps, and I don't know, I'm being a bit big-headed now, but he must have been impressed by me, because he said, "Why have you ever thought of joining the Intelligence Corps?" And I remember saying, well, I'd like to, but I don't think I would qualify. I said, I understand that you need a number of foreign languages. He said, oh, don't worry. He said, I've got a friend at the War Office in Intelligence. He said, I'll have a word with him. And you'll probably hear from him. And I thought, oh, I've heard that story many times before. That's the first and last time I shall hear about it. But within about 6 weeks, after the exercise, I was in a holding unit again prior to a new posting. And suddenly, after 6 weeks, I was called by the camp commandant and said, oh, you've got to go to Whitehall for an interview for the Intelligence Corps. So the officer who had invited me to consider joining the Intelligence Corps was as good as his word. It's quite remarkable, really. I was interviewed by 4 different people at the War Office. I went there rather timidly, feeling, this was it. I probably wouldn't get through the interview. And one of the early interviews was by a French professor who fired questions at us in French, and we had to answer in French. And I was hopeless, really. I've got to admit I was quite hopeless. And we were stood around, in fact, in a circle. There were half a dozen of us. And at the end of the examination, the oral examination, he said to me, "You've forgotten most of your French, haven't you?" And I had to admit that I had, and I thought, well, that's blown it. I've had it. The first interview, I think it was. Anyhow, the next one was with the Provost Marshal of the military police, and I told him what had happened. He said, "Oh, don't worry. More or less dismissed it." And I thought, well, that gives me hope. And then it was followed by 2 other people. I don't remember the interview with them very much. I think they were more or less, for the want of a better expression, tail enders, They weren't as important as the first 2. Anyhow, I was told at the end of the interview that was it. I'd been accepted. And so I went back to my holding unit then and waited for a posting to the Intelligence Corps depot, which at the time was at Wentworth Woodhouse, Earl Fitzwilliam's home. Oh, well, we had the basic training, actually, which all military depots provided at Wentworth Woodhouse. But after, I think it was something like 4 or 5 weeks, we had to go to what was known as the School of Military Intelligence at Matlock. And that was housed in what was then the old Hydro Hotel, a huge hotel. And of course it was like going back to college. One had to learn everything about the army, about the rank and file, and goodness knows what, information that we hadn't already been given, and how the Intelligence Corps operated, and we had to sit an examination at the end. I think it was 3 months we were there. I think it was 3 months. We had to sit an examination. And I remember that myself and 3 others, friends, decided we'd go out the night before the examination, and we hadn't swatted at all. And when we came back round about 10:30, I remember we sat down and fired questions at each other for about a couple of hours. And if I remember correctly, we all just about got through with a pass. I think the pass level was 60%, and I think we had something like 62, 63% on each one of them. Of course, one didn't take things too as seriously as we would have done had we been older. But there, at least, I passed the examination, and I was a fully fledged member of the Intelligence Corps then. At the time, I would be, I think I would be 23 then, 22 or 23. And my first posting in the Intelligence Corps was abroad, to Burma. So I didn't do any intelligence work in the UK.
And how did you feel about going overseas?
It didn't worry me unduly at the time. I had a girlfriend, which it was pretty hard, I suppose, leaving her at the time. But there again, one didn't anticipate being away for so long. I was in Burma and the Far East for 3.5 years without a leave. But I remember when we were sailing out of Liverpool, I thought, well, perhaps back in 12 months or so, but it didn't happen. Needless to say, my girlfriend got fed up of waiting, So that ended shortly after I had arrived in India. Well, when I went abroad, we docked. I went by ship through the Mediterranean. We docked at Bombay, and then we took a train from Bombay to the northwest frontier province, a place called Abbottabad. And that is really, in the thick of the troubled area now, Abbottabad, almost on the Afghanistan border. And the reason for taking us so far out, apparently, we learned afterwards, was to acclimatize us to the very much different conditions in India. And we were there for about a month. And then I moved along with my colleagues. There were a few of us, you see, who had gone out together. I moved with my colleague down to Karachi, which of course was all part of one country then, now one of the main cities of Pakistan, where what was known as the Indian School of Military Intelligence was based. And we attended a course at the Indian School of Military Intelligence for about 4 or 5 weeks to learn Urdu. So you see, the French didn't matter at all. And I got reasonably proficient, more proficient in Urdu than I had been in French, anyhow. And after that, we were posted out to various parts of India, and I went to Allahabad, which was the section headquarters. Do you know, I can't remember the number of the section now. But it was the section headquarters. Now, a section consisted normally of about 6 NCOs and 1 or 2 interpreters and an officer. And from Allahabad, I was sent out on detachment about 100 or so miles to Benares, the holy city of the Hindus, which is a city of something like 500,000 people, now known as Varanasi. It's a tourist centre, a very important tourist centre, being on the Ganges. And I was one of only 3 or 4 white soldiers based in Benares. There was a military hospital there, and there were certainly some Queen Alexander's English nurses there. And I remember one English soldier who was the administrator-in-chief. And my time there was most interesting indeed. I had all manner of duties to perform. A lot of power, do you say? Yes, I think members of the Intelligence Corps had a great deal of power. We were issued with a green card, which allowed us to interview anybody, even the highest ranking officer, if necessary. I mean, it didn't happen, and probably rarely happened, but an Intelligence Corps sergeant had the power with this card to interview even a general if necessary. And obviously it had to be guarded very carefully. You couldn't afford to misplace it. Not like the Johnnies today at intelligence headquarters. I was thinking, that if I had a member of the Intelligence Corps had lost the documents these people have in the government, I would have been court-martialed and put into a military prison.
What was it like to live there? Were you lonely?
No, because there were a number of Anglo-Indian people based in Benares. Apart from being the holy city and this very large city, it was also a railway centre. And a number of the Eurasians, as they were called, worked on the railways. So we did make friends with some of them, and or I made friends with some of them. It was quite comfortable, really. And I worked extensively there with the Assistant Superintendent of Police. Superintendents of Police in India at the time were all Englishmen. The top job it was for a particular province, but the deputy or assistant superintendents were invariably Indian. And I worked with a man called Brahma Singh, and he was an absolute top. And what he didn't know about intelligence work wasn't worth knowing. So I worked very much, I was very much in cahoots with him. Yes, there was free time because I had my own boss. I worked as I thought necessary, or when it was necessary. And oddly enough, in the cantonment area, cantonment's a military area, there was a bar for Europeans who were not there. And from time to time I had visits from the Special Investigation Branch of the military police. We worked very closely together. And a couple of them would come out for maybe a week or so to Benares, and we had the bar to ourselves. We helped ourselves. We more or less stocked it and administered it and everything. There was nobody else there. Yes, and we went occasionally to the houses of some of the Anglo-Indian friends we'd made. I don't recall feeling lonely at all. Although I often think that I wasted some of the time. I could have taken a leave myself from there and gone to places like Agra and the Taj Mahal, and I didn't, and I regret it very much. I remember in particular we had to keep a close eye on the railways because the Indian Congress Party at the time was trying to, if they'd had their way, they would have kicked the British out, war or no war, and they were very naughty indeed, and they were very adept at derailing express trains, and I would get telephone calls in the middle of the night saying that the Bombay-Patna so-and-so express had been derailed. Would I investigate? That was one task that I had, and another task, which was quite amusing, really. I received what we called sitraps at the time. They were just the same as teletext almost, and saying that to a lady of two ladies of disrepute had just arrived in Benares from the front line. That was Kohima. And would I investigate them because it was felt that they had been mixing with British troops and they may be a security risk. So I had the task of going to a hotel in Benares and interviewing them. That was an example of the sort of work we did in India. First of all, from Benares, for some reason, I never found out quite why, I went on a journey to what was then Ceylon, Sri Lanka, but it was known as Ceylon, of course, at the time, and stayed in Colombo, the capital city, for about a fortnight, then posted up into the hills, Kandy, and then back to Calcutta, and from Calcutta took the boat across to Burma. And why I went on this trip to Ceylon, I never knew, but it was the way the army operated. And in Burma, I joined, in Central Burma it was, I joined the 579 boat section, based at a place called Chaulk, spelled Chaulk, which had the responsibility of, for the want of a better term, patrolling the mighty Irrawaddy about 150 miles north towards Mandalay and 150 miles south towards a place called Frome. And we had, for the task, we had half a dozen small boats powered by outboard motors. And at the time, I was posted as a sergeant, but in a very short time I was made up to company sergeant major. And then the officer, OC, in charge of the section went home for demobilization, and I was given the rank of Regimental Sergeant Major and officiating officer commanding. So I was in charge of the section entirely then for probably about 6 months or so. And it was a most interesting operation. Members of the section, usually 2 at a time, sometimes 1, sometimes 2, with an interpreter and a member of what was known as the Burmese Intelligence Corps. They were mostly made up of Anglo-Burmese troops and could speak the language, obviously. And they would set off on a trek upriver or downriver, probably for about 3 days. Obviously, one didn't just go out for the day. They were going 150 miles at about 8 knots an hour, no more than that upstream, or less than that upstream, a bit faster downstream. And they would visit riverine villages, seeking generally intelligence about the Japanese, war crimes, of course, any information that would lead toward a war crimes trial, and leakage of information, generally what you would expect in the way of security. And I say that was most interesting. I remember that on one occasion I went out with a patrol, and we were going to a town upstream called Pakoko, and the police had been misbehaving there. We'd heard all sorts of horrendous stories about them, bribery, corruption, and torture, so we were given the task of investigating it. And we had a special boat made for that, because by that time, the Burma Oil Company, some of the Burma Oil Company people were returning. The Japs had been pushed south and west, you see, away from the area. And the Burmese oil people started to return, and they had their craftsmen there, and they made a lovely boat for us, a bigger boat. And we set sail one evening at midnight, I remember, to try and catch these police off guard. And what a horrendous journey it was. We had a pilot, incidentally, who was supposed to know everything about the Irrawaddy, because there were so many sandbanks in it. And at the time, the water level was fairly low. It was some time after the monsoons. And I remember we hit sandbank after sandbank in the middle of the river. And really and truly, and I say this seriously, it's a wonder I'm here today, any of us, because had the boat capsized, it would have been lost. Very, very lucky to be alive, but somehow we survived, and we eventually arrived at a hillock overlooking the town of Pakoko and the police station. We knew exactly where it was located. That would be about 7 o'clock in the morning, so you know how difficult it was going upstream. We'd left at about midnight, and we only had something like 25 miles to travel. And we could hear noises coming from the police station. It was obviously they were engaging in drunken revelry. They were a right bunch of so-and-sos. And so we were looking down at them, and I ordered one of my sergeants to, or asked him to fire a shot over the police station. We had a rifle with us, and they fired back at us. Fortunately, they missed it. But we decided discretion was better than valor. We didn't pursue that. We reported what was happening. We went to the home. We doubled back about half a mile, I should think, to the home of an agent we had engaged, a Burmese lady called Marnie. And we sought refuge there for the time being because we didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, if you had a bunch of something like 30 or 40 policemen all drunk, they could have chased us. That might have been the end. So we went to the home of this lady, Marnie, and I remember she made us the most delicious fish curry. Anyhow, we returned in the evening back to base and reported what had happened, and I think they were disciplined by their own people. My boat section, the 579 section, had disbanded. The officer had gone home. Well, I told you that. He'd gone home previously, and I had the task of disbanding the section, and I was posted to a holding intelligence unit in Mamio, a place called Mamio in the Shan States, up in the hills. So I took my jeep and motored up there, and I was at a loose end for about 3 or 4 weeks, just sort of doing any jobs that they would like me to do. And that was good experience because they were covering a very different area of Burma, right up to the Chinese border. And I would go out with them just, for the interest and experience. And after about 4 or 5 weeks, I think it would be, I received a telephone call from the top intelligence officer at Burma Command saying he had a new job for me in southwest Burma, something like 500 or 600 miles away. And he warned me, he said, you've got something on your hands because the Sergeant Major there had just blown his brains out. He said, unfortunately, it got a bit too much for him, war crimes investigation and things like that. And the OC is suffering from a nervous breakdown. He'll probably be going home soon. And so he said, you know what you're going into. So I remember taking the train down to this place called Basin, almost on the Bay of Bengal. And the OC, who was suffering from a nervous breakdown, met me on the station, and I remember him saying, how pleased I am to see you, how pleased. He almost, worshipped me because they were in such dire strait, and took me back to their headquarters, which was a house they'd commandeered. And you've never seen such a mess in all your life. The fining system was non-existent, and they were investigating war crimes. But it was an absolute mess, the fining system. A stranger would never be able to follow it at all. I remember my first task was to say, right, tomorrow we'll have all these so-called files thrown in the middle of the floor. And my words, there were a lot of them, you see. And I said, we'll start out a sorting job and establish a new fining system. And that's exactly what we did. And of course, that took some time. But at least when it was ended, we knew what we were doing. And from then on, of course, it was mostly investigating war crimes. Yes, there was an RAF attack over this city of Basin, and the plane was shot down, and the rear gunner was a man named Flight Sergeant Woodrow, and he bailed out, and on his way down, a Japanese unit based in Basin fired tracer bullets at him, which hit his arm, and by the time he landed with his parachute, his arm was very emaciated. And the local hospital was only some 300 yards away, but a Japanese officer with the rank of captain just pulled out his sword and cut his arm off. That was one we investigated.
How did you go about getting evidence?
You get it mostly from the local population, the civilian. They knew what was happening, you see. They had to adhere to the whims and fancies of the Japanese troops, obviously. They couldn't step out of line, but once they'd gone, they were quite willing to open up and tell you everything that had happened. We had to interrogate people, yeah.
Can you explain to me a little bit about the interrogation? What was the room like? What line of questioning? How long was the process?
Well, of course, you first of all, you had to establish a unit where they'd been stationed and what their task was and things like that.
Did you ever have to use violence?
No, we didn't. No, we threatened, but we never did use violence. I remember particularly with some awkward Burmese. There were one or two awkward Burmese who were pro-Japanese, and they had misbehaved, and we interviewed those. And if you couldn't get the information that you knew you wanted and you knew they had it, you would threaten them. But we never committed violence, never. No, wasn't the British Army's style. Well, I was very pleased, obviously. It's wrong to say that we were pleased when we heard that the hydrogen bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki. But as young soldiers, we were probably pleased in a way. One doesn't realize the amount of damage done to the civilian population. And, well, the end of the war, and after three and a half years, one was looking forward to going home. I didn't go home. I stayed on because I thought it very necessary and to investigate war crimes, and I enjoyed doing it. It was a job that close to my heart. And in fact, I don't think I've told you this before, but I was recommended for a field commission, what was known as a field commission, which would give me the rank of lieutenant and then go subsequently captain and in charge of a section. And the head, the top man, the man I've referred to before at Burma Command, rang me one day and said, would I go over to Rangoon for interview? The Japanese were almost pushed out of Burma at the time. Would I fly to Rangoon, 200 miles, for interview by the brigadier who was coming up from Singapore? And I was duly interviewed, and I was told by the Burma Command officer, come back tomorrow morning. I think it was a weekend, Saturday when I was interviewed. Come back tomorrow morning and I'll let you know how you got on. And I remember going back and knocking at the door of his office, and a voice called out, come in, Lieutenant Wolfenden. And I thought, oh, that's good. And I walked in. I said, why, did my face fit? He said, yes, he thought you were okay. And I said, well, what happened now? He said, well, the promotion will be announced in Part 3 orders. In 2 or 3 weeks' time, go back to your unit and you'll be informed. I was never informed. I waited and waited and waited and finally inquired what was happening, and I was told that the poor old brigadier had been lost at sea flying back to Singapore. So I said, well, how does that place me? And I was told, well, you have to go for another interview now. I said, oh, bubbles. I decided I'd had long enough and decided to come home. I think they affected me very much. I always say that I learned so much in the Intelligence Corps. It was such a good regiment. Moved about with some very, very interesting and intelligent people. And I think it befitted me for civilian life. I would say, yes, almost, or even perhaps better than taking a university course. Because you see, it was very difficult to get into university at that time. Only the brightest of people, about one per school per academic year, made university. So all my studying had been done at night school. You know, after leaving high school, went to night school, and 4 nights a week. I was studying at the time accountancy, and got about halfway towards my examination, then decided when I came home that I wanted to go into the oil industry, having been based in Chaulk, you see, the centre of the oil industry in Burma. And I was accepted then for a business training course, which was operated by 1 or 2 colleges up and down the country. There was one at Leeds. I think it was in the Leeds College of Art, and one at Rotherham. And I got onto this course. I think it was a 3 or 6 month course. And at the time, there was such a shortage of young men for managerial positions, they more or less guaranteed to place one in a job. And I completed my course and opted for the oil industry. And they said, well, there's no oil industry in this area. But the nearest was a firm in Leeds called Adolf Hess and Brother Limited. And they had distillation facilities, and it wasn't exactly a mineral oil operation, but they distilled animal and vegetable oils. So it was a new relation, you see. And I joined them, and I was very lucky. And I still think you asked the question about how did it befit me. I think I wouldn't have advanced as quickly as I had done if I hadn't had my Intelligence Corps experience. And I became Assistant Works Manager trainee at this company, then Assistant Works Manager, then within about 12 months, Works Manager. Finished up Managing Director, so I didn't do too badly. It's wrong to say that one enjoyed one's wartime experience. I had almost 7.5 years, usually 7.25 years. It's a long, long time in the army. And in some ways, I regret that it took so much out of my life. I was quite I'm being a bit immodest, but I was quite a good cricketer before I joined the army. Played quite a number of games at high level in the army for the army team. But you see, that was vital as far as my sporting life was concerned. When I came home, I was, 27, 28, I'd lost vital years there. But by and large, I don't think I would have changed it.